late November 1998, Chicago police cordoned off a section of the city's northwest side. Reporters and onlookers gathered on the chance that there might be a gruesome discovery. Police had received a tip that the yard behind this picket fence had been used as a burial ground 20 years earlier by John Wayne Gacy. Investigators dug it up and found nothing at all. And yet the attention lavished on this one bad lead was a fitting postscript to the life of a man who fooled the world while he killed at least 33 people. In the Chicago winter of 1942, John and Marion Gacy awaited the birth of their second child. The young couple already had a daughter, but John longed for a son to carry on the family name. On March 17th, he got his wish when Marion gave birth to a boy. They named him John Wayne, after Marion's favorite movie star. The Gacy children, including a third child, Karen, born 2 years later, grew up in this modest bungalow in a blue-collar neighborhood. Their father, the son of Polish immigrants and a World War I veteran, worked as a machinist building control panels for utility companies. Gacy Sr. was an uncompromising man who demanded obedience from his children, especially his only son. He expected Johnny to be like the other boys who played stickball, climbed trees, and fished. The father was an avid fisherman and tried to teach his son the sport, but the boy had no interest. Instead, Johnny would much rather cook with his sisters or garden with his mother. The father would often ridicule Johnny in front of his sisters and other children in the neighborhood.
Taunts from a father toward his son can be devastating.
While Johnny's father was rigid and emotionally distant, the boy developed a special bond with his mother.
Mom was confident. You could go to Mom and tell her a lot of things that you couldn't talk to Dad about. And I think my dad felt threatened by that, felt like they were keeping secrets from him.
Marion was a homemaker, but her husband acted as if he ran the household. The couple argued frequently about everything, from chores to child rearing.
She tried so hard to keep the family together, knowing that her husband drank, and when he drank, he went into rages, and he usually turned on John.
After his shift on the assembly line, Johnny's father would escape to the basement, where he would drink brandy before supper. Marion and the children would wait at the dinner table in fear and silence until he climbed the stairs drunk. If the children misbehaved, he would spank them with a razor strap.
We actually learned how to toughen up against it. And John especially, he would not cry. He would not cry, and sometimes I think that made Dad angry.
Johnny not only felt alienated at home, he longed to be accepted by his classmates, but a congenital heart condition prevented him from playing with the other kids.
I was wrestling around with some older kids, and I passed out, and I remained unconscious for about 10 or 15 minutes. We went to the doctor, and they said I had an enlarged bottleneck heart, so I was more or less like a sickly kid.
Gacy's father expressed no sympathy for his son and saw the heart condition as one more failure. He pressured the boy to do well in school. Johnny disappointed his father even more when he fell behind in his studies because he was at home sick so often. In 1954, when he was 12, Johnny made his first real attempt at fitting in with the other boys when he joined the Boy Scouts. He earned merit badges in wilderness survival and campfire cooking. But despite his sense of belonging and achievement, Johnny knew he was different from the rest of the troop. The only other person who recognized this was his best friend, Barry Bushelli. One afternoon, while playing in his bedroom, Johnny shared a secret with his friend.
Johnny had his mother's silk panties and bra sitting in a bag in this closet. I was astounded. I said, Johnny, what are you doing with those things? And he said to me, he said, I wonder if I ever dressed up as a woman, how I would look.
Young Gacy was deeply confused about his sexuality, but there was no one to help him, so he buried his secret deep inside. By the time he entered high school, the young man had learned to hide his confusion. John dated several girls and attended school dances with them. But neither his grades nor his health improved. In 1960, while attending Prosser Vocational High School, John was learning the printing trade. He had several fainting spells in shop class. His teachers agreed that he would never be able to work with machinery. John dropped out. He had disappointed his father yet again.
I couldn't get along with my father. I mean, he was just overbearing. I was dumb and stupid, never would amount to anything, and so I just took off and said, to hell with it.
In 1964, when John was 22, he accepted a job as a shoe salesman in Springfield, Illinois, the state capital, about 200 miles south of Chicago. On his own and free from his father's resentment, John was determined to make a name for himself. His mother, Marion, and sister, Karen, both thought a little independence was exactly what he needed.
That was John's, I hate to say the word salvation, but I think that that's where he came alive. He became himself.
Gacy craved acceptance and found it through volunteer work with the Junior Chamber of Commerce, better known as the JCs. Working harder than he ever did in school, Gacy organized anti-litter campaigns and booked speakers for sex education classes in the public schools. Soon, John found himself hobnobbing with politicians, including on several occasions, Illinois Governor Otto Kerner.
He was always very eager to volunteer to do anything at all. Whatever came up, he was eager to do. But he also, at the same time, wanted to make sure that he got his name in the paper or some recognition of some kind.
In February 1964, Gacy began dating a shy bookkeeper who worked with him at the shoe store, named Marlene Myers. Marlene's family was better off than his own, and John saw the relationship as another avenue for him to get ahead. That September, the couple married. The following year, his new wife became pregnant.
They were real excited about the baby coming, and John was just really, I mean, he just gleamed the real proud father thing. You know, he just glowed.
John was thrilled with the prospect of becoming a father, but the yearnings he had repressed as a boy were forcing their way back to the surface. On February 24, 1966, while Marlene was in labor in the hospital, John was at a bar with a male coworker.
We went to his house, and instead of having coffee, we had a couple more drinks, and I must have passed out. I woke up laying on his bed with no clothes on.
Gacy had oral sex with the man, and the next morning felt both exhilarated and ashamed. He pretended nothing had happened. He rushed to the hospital to see his wife and his newborn son, Michael.
He was such a good father when Michael was born. He was very nurturing, and he'd kiss them and he'd hold them, and he didn't learn that, I know. So it was just like a natural thing to him.
John's parents came down from Chicago to meet their grandson. For the first time, John saw pride in his father's eyes.
He was happy when he saw my brother settle down and get married and have a family. He was happy. It was like John reached the ultimate with that it was okay. He got through all of that, and now he's a family man.
Gacy seemed to have everything he wanted: a family, a good job, and a new relationship with his father. But over the next 2 years, the real John Wayne Gacy would be revealed.
He dressed like a clown to make children laugh. But behind the face paint was a man who tortured and murdered. He was John Wayne Gacy. To the end, John Wayne Gacy proclaimed his innocence.
Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, because you will have executed somebody that didn't commit the crime.
Spring 1992. Killer John Wayne Gacy tries to rewrite history.
When they paint the image that I was this monster who picked up like these altar boys along the street and swatted them like flies, I said, this is ludicrous. Whether it's Berkowitz, whether it's Bundy, whether it's Williams, Wayne Williams down in Atlanta, or any of the others, or Charlie Manson. See, I don't comment about other cases for the simple fact is that I wasn't there.
Do you feel somewhat of a kinship with some of these people?
God, I hate that when they put me in the same club with them.
With his execution date just months away, Gacy, then 51, was seeking a new trial.
If people don't want to know the truth and the honesty of it, if they want to be convinced or brainwashed into what they believe, then fine, then go ahead and kill me. But vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, because you will have executed somebody that didn't commit the crime.
By the mid-1960s, John Wayne Gacy had made a name for himself as a young civic leader in Springfield, Illinois, and by all accounts had a promising future. But the ambitious family man was hiding a sexual compulsion that threatened to ruin him. In 1966, John, his wife Marlene, and their infant son moved to Waterloo, Iowa, a small town about 100 miles north of Des Moines. John's father-in-law owned 3 Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurants in Waterloo. Business was booming, and he needed a manager. So, at 24, his son-in-law began learning the restaurant business. John loved being the boss and insisted that his employees and friends call him Colonel.
He wanted to be able to control people. He loved the idea that he could tell people, this is what I want you to do. I'm the boss.
John put in 16-hour days, but his commitment to the JCs never faltered. He was soon considered the most valuable new member in the Waterloo chapter.
I think probably it's just John's personality. He was very ambitious and wanted to be loved by everybody and liked by everybody and accepted, and it was just his way.
Local JC President Charles Hill was impressed with John's charm and powers of persuasion. The JCs appointed him chairman of their membership drive.
And talk about a membership chairman that no holds barred. I mean, he just did everything he could do to get new members, and he did it. He did the job.
Gacy lured men into joining the JCs by inviting them to the Clayton House Motel, where he screened illegal stag films and hosted orgies with prostitutes. In one evening, he signed up 20 new members. John's sexual romps also carried over into his marriage, with the full participation of his wife, Marlene. After an evening out, they would often swap spouses with other couples. When John's sister Karen came in from Chicago for a visit, her brother and sister-in-law revealed their little bedroom secrets.
He said, sometimes we don't always go home with the same persons we came with. I really thought it was a joke, but when it came time to go home, he took somebody else home to their house. That was the first time I felt I didn't know my brother, that I didn't know him. And I definitely, you can imagine how my thoughts diminished about this sister-in-law.
The Waterloo JCs knew all about John's sexual escapades, but that didn't keep him from earning enough votes to win the JC vice presidency and being honored as their Man of the Year. By 1967, he was a shoo-in for JC president and the father of another child named Christine. Yet there was a side to Gacy that his family and cronies had never seen, an insatiable lust for teenage boys. One afternoon, while Marlene and the kids were away, John invited over 15-year-old Donald Voorhees, whose father was a JC and an Iowa state senator. Gacy asked the teenager if he had ever watched a stag film. When he said no, John set up the projector in his basement. He got Donald drunk to lower his inhibitions, then forced himself on the boy. Young Voorhees engaged in oral sex with Gacy. Afterwards, John hinted that he had mob connections back in Chicago. He threatened the teenager and paid him $50 for his silence.
The kid, over the next period of time, just was beside himself, couldn't do anything, did not go to the police right away, felt, as Gacy had said, that in fact nobody would believe him.
In March 1968, the teenager finally broke down and revealed everything to his family. His parents pressed charges against Gacy, who was arrested and charged with sodomy.
Well, Gacy took the charges out there terribly. He was at first very, very vigilant in his protection of himself and his family. He was one of these, it was one-on-one, it wasn't me who did this, I wouldn't have done it, the kid's a liar.
Gacy was convinced he could outsmart his accusers and insisted he be given a lie detector test. He failed. Investigators even joked that the only truthful answer came when he was asked his name.
He felt that his world had crumbled. People would see him coming and they didn't want to be around him. And I think it drastically affected his personality.
During the investigation, other teenage boys came forward with allegations of sexual abuse. Gacy pleaded guilty to the sodomy charge, but insisted that 15-year-old Voorhees willingly engaged in oral sex with him.
This young individual made the charge at me. He claims that he was sexually abused by me. And in essence, he was blackmailing me for it. Now, what it boiled down to was oral copulation. And it was consensual.
The judge didn't see it that way and gave Gacy the maximum sentence, 10 years at the state penitentiary in Anamosa. He would never see his wife Marlene or his children again. Gacy arrived at the prison in December 1968.
It's like he accepted it, like I did the crime so I get the time. And I mean, he didn't say anything, but just, he didn't break down. Again, he didn't cry. He did not cry. We all cried, including my father.
Even behind bars, Gacy aggressively pursued all of the social outlets available to him. He not only made friends with fellow prisoners, but he mingled with the guards, social workers, and even the warden. Within 8 months, Gacy landed a job as head cook in the prison kitchen. He loved trying out new recipes for the inmates.
I can say unreservedly that the quality of the food improved dramatically. One thing John was a very, very, very fine cook. And he understood something that traditionally folks who cook in prisons don't understand. He understood the use of spices.
In December 1969, a TV film crew visited the prison to shoot a segment called Christmas at Anamosa. In this rare footage, the head cook spoke with pride about the meal he was preparing for his fellow inmates.
Well, I'm John Gacy. I'm from Waterloo, Iowa.
And you're a man of some authority here. What is your title?
Well, I'm first cook in the kitchen, and I run the morning meal and the afternoon meal in the kitchen.
John, how long have you been here?
I've been here now a year and about 2 weeks.
Why am I asking how long do you plan to take up residence here?
Well, I hope to be getting out sometime in May.
Well, good. Good. You're going to continue as a cook, use that as a profession?
Right. This is my profession before I came in.
All right.
Food service.
Well, now, how about Christmas time? You do anything special for the guys? What are you planning for old Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, for example?
Well, Christmas Eve, the food service department, under the direction of Mr. John Breimer, will prepare stockings that we hand out. Well, actually, they're paper bags that'll have fruit, an apple and an orange, and a box of Bridge Mix candy. Mm-hmm. And this is all from the staff here. They donate this. Then in the cell houses at night on Christmas Eve, we will serve cookies and hot chocolate to the men in the cell houses. This is around 8:30, 9 o'clock at night. Then come Christmas Day, we serve a regular traditional Christmas dinner.
Now tell us about that. What's that going to be?
This is quite a meal. This will be roast whole turkey. We use 25 whole turkeys that are approximately 540 pounds of turkey that we fix. We start preparing this on the day before. This is all prepared by inmates, and there's 9 cooks under my direction and under the supervision of several supervisors that are assigned to the food area. Along with that, we'll make up 10 bake pans, large baking pans of oyster dressing. We use 8 gallons of oyster in that. And we use the giblets and everything so it doesn't go to waste. We make a nice giblet gravy. We'll have candied sweet potatoes and use about 36 gallons of that. And so that they have a choice of potato, we make up 250 pounds of mashed potatoes to go along with it. Along with that, we'll use some 60 pounds of mixed vegetables to serve a mixed vegetable as the second vegetable on the line. We'll have 50 pounds of cranberry sauce made up. And we'll make up a Waldorf salad. And our Waldorf salad is your walnut meats, and we use fresh marshmallows, fresh green grapes, and fruit cocktail, and make up our own whipped cream topping with it. And we sometimes go through as much as 45 gallons of this on the line. The men, with the exception of the turkey, which they get a generous proportion of, and the pumpkin pie that will be served, are allowed to take as much as they want to eat. The only requirement is that you eat what you take. On this happy morning, oh Jesus, to thee,
In Rockford, Illinois today, jury selection begins for a mass murder trial that will actually be conducted in Chicago. It's been more than a year since the murders were discovered, but Chris Kelly reports emotion in the case remains high.
You might be witnessing one of the most horrible crimes, perhaps, in a century.
It was a grisly scene. Day after day, the bodies of boys and young men being taken out of the home of John Wayne Gacy. 29 decomposed corpses were found under the house and surrounding grounds. 4 other bodies were discovered in a river several miles away. In all, Gacy is charged with 33 murders over a 7-year period. More than a year later, 11 victims remain unidentified. Authorities claim the 37-year-old building contractor used job offers and sometimes strong-arm methods to bring his young male victims to his home for intended homosexual activities. Most were killed, a few escaped.
Definitely threatened me with that he had guns in the house, and that if he had to, if I went to the police or told anyone about his advances upon me, that I would be endangered with that, and that he wanted me to realize how easy it would have been for him to kill me right then and there.
Police searched the home for several months looking for other victims. The house was so badly dismantled that it had to be torn down. Gacy has pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. During 3 of his pretrial court appearances, he collapsed and was hospitalized for apparent heart problems. But doctors have been unable to find any health problems serious enough to prevent him from standing trial. Among those the defense would like to call as potential witnesses is Rosalind Carter, who posed with Gacy for this 1976 photograph. At the time, Gacy was a Democratic volunteer campaign worker. Because of the enormous publicity generated by the case, the jury will be selected in Rockford, 90 miles away from Chicago. The city was picked because a study showed that of 5 potential sites, people here had been subjected to the least number of news accounts of the case. The selection of the jury here in this Rockford courtroom and the subsequent trial itself in Chicago represent an unprecedented legal procedure in Illinois. The hope is that this, along with sequestering the jury, will assure Gacy a fair trial.
It was 1978 when the world first saw the horrifying images of body bags being pulled from John Wayne Gacy's house near Chicago, and of Gacy, later convicted in the torture murders of 33 young men and boys and condemned to die.
December 1978, when a 15-year-old boy disappeared. He was one of a number of boys who had disappeared in the Chicago area, but something about him was different. The boy was Rob Peast, a sophomore in high school who worked part-time at the Nissan pharmacy in the northwestern suburbs of Chicago. On December 11th, at quitting time, He told his mother he was going to talk to a man about a construction job, but Rob Peast never made it home. His parents finally ended up at the police department to fill out a missing persons report on their youngest son. At the time, the man in charge of the state's attorney's office was Terry Sullivan.
One young police officer happened to come up the one morning, and he said, "Terry, there's a couple that was here last night reporting their son missing, and I think there's something strange to it. I don't believe that he's a runaway."
Sullivan agreed. Rob Peast was the consummate good kid, devoted to his family, an honor student who wanted to be an astronaut. There was no reason for him to run away. Something was wrong. Immediately, a search was organized. His parents were devastated.
Well, I went to pick up Rob at the drugstore where he works at about 10 to 9. And he says it would take a few minutes, that he wanted to talk to this contractor about a job. And then with that, I started browsing around the store, and I'd never seen him since.
For police, the most obvious lead was the contractor Rob had gone to meet. His name was John Gacy. As it turned out, Gacy often hired young boys. 2 days after Rob disappeared, Sullivan called Gacy into the police station.
And he basically just said he had no idea what we were talking about. He denied even knowing the kid, and in frustration, I had said to him that, well, I understand that you don't want to say anything, but we've got evidence that, in fact, you were seen with him very recently.
Soon after that confrontation in mid-December 1978, police began tracking the movements of John Wayne Gacy.
Back in Chicago, his father was battling cirrhosis of the liver. On Christmas morning, John Stanley Gacy died. The news devastated his son. He was convinced that his father died of shame over his sodomy conviction.
He felt like he stripped him of any dignity. He was remorseful about that, that he disappointed him in such a way that it killed him. And a lot of times we'd sit and we'd talk, and I'd say, "John, you didn't. It was a disease. Dad's drinking is what created his death."
Gacy's grief quickly turned to rage, which he took out on inmates he suspected were gay. One afternoon while walking back to his cell, he spotted 2 prisoners having oral sex. Gacy kicked one of the men in the face, then returned to his cell.
There was someone who was struggling with an inner demon that did not have to do with hating homosexuals, but with being attracted to them. And John hated prison every day that he was there. After his father's death, a lot of hates, including that one, became much more powerful in his personality.
On June 18, 1970, prison officials released him on good behavior. He had served 16 months of his 10-year sentence. Gacy returned to his boyhood home, Chicago, where he began to rebuild his life. And yet, the longer Gacy kept a tight lid on his sexual urges, the closer he came to exploding. In June 1970, 28-year-old John Wayne Gacy left Iowa after serving time in prison for committing sodomy with a teenage boy. His wife had divorced him, and he would never see her or his 2 children again. John returned to his hometown, Chicago, alone, and let his family there know that he was determined to start a new life. Gacy moved in with his recently widowed mother and got a job as a short-order cook. John worked hard and stashed away every penny he made.
It's like he couldn't rest. Something definitely was driving him. And His temperament was different. It's almost as if he had a little plan of action. He was going to be successful.
By June 1971, Gacy had saved enough money to start his own contracting company. He called it PDM, for painting, decorating, and maintenance. The following year, John and his mother bought this ranch house in Norwood Park on the outskirts of Chicago. By now, he had a steady girlfriend named Carol Hoff, who was recently divorced and on welfare. Gacy had known her since high school. John confided in Carol about his bisexuality and his prison record. She was naturally concerned, but tolerant. She saw her boyfriend as a hard-working, caring man her children loved. From the beginning of their courtship, her two daughters, Tammy and April, called him Daddy.
He loved the girls, and they loved him. There's no doubt about that. But his and Carol's relationship was that of a friendship as well as their love for one another.
Yet Carol's affection was not enough for Gacy. He could no longer control his hidden attraction to teenage boys. Something deep inside of him was about to snap. On January 2nd, 1972, Gacy picked up 16-year-old Tim McCoy at the Greyhound bus station. John offered to show the boy the sights, then lured him back to his house, where they engaged in sex. When they were done, Gacy grabbed a kitchen knife and plunged it into the teenager's chest. Then he buried the body in the crawl space under his house.
It was impulsive. He really hadn't planned on killing him. But I think that once he did make that move, it gave him the ultimate power trip.
Gacy was able to act as if nothing had happened. 7 months later, he and Carol were married. She and her daughters moved in with John. His mother moved out to give the newlyweds privacy. Soon after the wedding, John's relationship with his wife began to deteriorate. He still longed for sex with young men, wherever and whenever he could find it. On the night of July 31st, 1975, Gacy had the house to himself and invited over one of his young employees. 16-year-old John Butkovich had worked for Gacy for nearly a year. First, on the pretext of doing a magic trick, he coaxed the boy into slipping on a pair of handcuffs.
And he says, "What's the trick to this? I can't get these things off." And at that time, Gacy went in his pocket and grabbed the key to the handcuffs and says, "The trick is you have to have the key."
Then, with his victim gagged by his own underwear, the sexual torture began. Afterwards, Gacy looped a rope around the teenager's neck, then slid a stick between the knots.
It's in a tourniquet, so it cut off the air. So if you're going to kill somebody, you just put it on their neck and twist it 3 times or 4 times or whatever until the person stopped moving.
He removed the handcuffs and disposed of the body. Now Gacy had killed twice. His psychiatrists would come to believe that the motive could be traced to his abusive childhood.
There began to be a confusion between feeling better about himself in the sense of empowering himself to overcome this childhood sense of failure and his sexual desires and needs.
He liked handcuffs. He liked to hurt people. But he did it more in the sense of wanting to experiment to see how somebody would react.
Gacy's double life had taken shape. Family, friends, and business associates had no idea who the real John Wayne Gacy was. Not only was he a prosperous entrepreneur by day, but even entertained children in hospitals. He would dress up as a clown he called Pogo.
When I got into clown makeup, I regressed into childhood. It was fun being a clown because you could be yourself or just let yourself go and act a fool.
Gacy even dabbled in Cook County politics and was named a Democratic precinct captain.
He would help people. He would do favors for people. The old-fashioned precinct captain, if they needed something, a garbage can or something, he'd get it, a Christmas tree, he'd get it for them. If they needed construction work, he would do it and have somebody do it for them. Everybody knew John Gacy, and he knew everybody in his precinct.
But Gacy's hectic schedule was taking its toll on his marriage. He had stopped having sex with his wife, Carol, and they bickered constantly. One afternoon in 1975, John berated Carol for spending too much money. After 3 years of marriage with him, she filed for divorce and soon left the house with her daughters. Now single again, the 33-year-old Gacy was like a wild beast uncaged. With no wife and children to look after, he resumed his hunt for young men. Gacy would abduct teenage boys, sometimes at gunpoint, and drive them back to his suburban house, where he would rape and kill them. But he was growing tired of digging holes in his crawl space. He wanted graves readily available. Gacy hired an unsuspecting employee, David Cram, to trench for piping and instructed him to break ground only in the areas he had marked.
He would lay out the trench. All right, this is where you dig, this is where you dig. Don't vary from the path. And there was also comments about the time factor. He'd come down, see how I was doing. How's it going? Are we done yet? You done being down there?
Cram also rented the spare bedroom in his boss's house. He returned home one night and found Gacy drunk and dressed in his clown costume. Gacy invited Cram to join him for a drink. The men had a few Mai Tais. Then Gacy tricked Cram into the handcuffs.
And he's laughing, ha, 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 you know, just like a little kid. You know, and again, I'm standing there looking at a clown in a clown suit, laughing at me because I'm locked up. And he's like, poke me. Does it bother you? Huh? Does that bother you? Huh? So I told him, I said, if you don't take these off, I'm going to kick your ass.
The teenager then saw a side of his boss that few ever lived to tell about.
It was just like a light switch went off in the middle of a conversation, in the middle of a sentence, in the middle of a thought. He just starts growling like a mad dog.
Gacy lunged at Cram and swung him around the room, shouting, "I'm going to rape you." Despite the handcuffs, Cram was able to push Gacy to the ground. He somehow managed to grab the key and escape to his room. David Cram moved out. Others were not so lucky. By the end of 1977, Gacy had killed 19 young men in his home, all the while carefully maintaining his double life.
Indian rope trick. But for this, I need music. Go ahead, blow on it. What does he want? I have no idea. Look at it bend and writhe like a snake, ladies and gentlemen. Woo! Oh, boys and girls. Now, for my next trick, I need an assistant. Who wants to help Pogo? Who wants to? No, I need somebody very smart, very talented, and very cute. How about you? Sure, you come on over here. Come on, boys and girls. Get them to come over here and help Pogo. Yeah, come on and help Pogo. Come on. Come on. Here he comes. Come on. Get the hair out of your head. Yay! Hi. You want to help Pogo? Yeah, good. What's your name? Brian Hollister. Brian Hollister is going to help Pogo with the handcuff trick. A handcuff trick, that's right. Well, for a handcuff trick, we need handcuffs, don't we? Oh, no. We need real handcuffs, don't we, huh? I know where we can find some real handcuffs, boys and girls. Keep right here. I'll be right back. Okay, here we go. We're gonna come over here and get some real handcuffs. Here they are, right over here.
He says you want to talk to me? What the hell's going on with my vehicles? I need them for my business. You get them back when the investigation is over. Oh, really? Well, the investigation is over. I'm suing you and your hick department for $1 million. How do you like them apples, dummy? Don't you have nightmares? Horrible nightmares, Mr. Gacy. I do. Oh, Mr. Policeman. Don't you know a clown can get away with murder? Huh?
boys and girls. Handcuffs. Handcuffs. Okay, Brian, turn around and put your hands behind your back. Here we go. Here we go, boys and girls. That's it. Turn around, Brian. Now, let me have your wrist. And then we'll put one on here. And we'll put one on here. Are they tight? Are they really tight? Really tight. Are they really, really tight? Really, really tight. Okay, Brian, that's good. Now, kids, here's the trick.
Gacy had been convicted 10 years earlier in Iowa. The charge was sodomy. The victim, a teenage boy. Gacy was released from the Iowa Men's Reformatory after serving only 18 months. Because of Gacy's record, a 24-hour surveillance was ordered. David Hackmeister, then a 6-year veteran of the department and a young father of 3, was assigned to the job.
I knew that, in fact, they thought that this could be a homicide. They asked me to keep surveillance on the house.
It soon became obvious that a concealed surveillance of John Gacy would be impossible. Gacy often drove over 60 through city streets. Over several days, frustration grew as two-man teams followed Gacy on fruitless journeys throughout metropolitan Chicago.
His personality could change in a split second. You know, one second we're his best buddy, we're his bodyguards that he's introducing us people to, and the next second we'll go into another bar and we're from the FBI who are harassing him.
As the days went on, there was still no sign of Rob Peast. His family posted his picture throughout the neighborhood. Then, a lead. Gacy told the surveillance team that he owned some land up north in Wisconsin.
So right away we're thinking that's where the body is. Of course, he's feeding us this information knowing that we're going to follow up on this, just kind of leading us off the track.
Work at the state's attorney's office was more productive. The investigators had obtained a search warrant for Gacy's house, based on Gacy's sodomy conviction 10 years earlier in Iowa.
My hopes, of course the hopes of the police officers and my fellow state's attorneys, was that we would find Rob alive.
When police investigators entered Gacy's home, it was fastidiously neat. They collected an assortment of items: handcuffs, garter belts. One officer picked up a photo receipt from Nissan Pharmacy. But of all the items found, one of the most chilling was a class ring. It was quickly learned that the ring belonged to a recent high school graduate named John Zick, who, like Rob Peast, was missing. It was just the beginning. Through interviews with Gacy's acquaintances, it was discovered that 2 employees of Gacy's were also missing: Gregory Godzik and Johnny Butkovich. Both 17 years old, both had not been heard from for at least 2 years. An unmistakable pattern began to emerge, linking Gacy to missing boys.
So it was as if a trickle had started and now all of a sudden it's turned into a waterfall.
It was then that the investigators got 2 final breaks. First, a fellow employee of Rob Peast revealed that she had put her photo receipt in Peast's jacket. That receipt was the same one found in Gacy's house. It provided a critical link, proving that John Gacy had contact with Rob Peast the night Rob disappeared. And there was more. Interviews with Gacy's employees revealed they had been asked by Gacy to dig trenches for new plumbing in the crawl space beneath the house. The story triggered a memory for a detective who had once used the bathroom in Gacy's house.
Mind you, again, it's cold winter, and the furnace came up from bringing the fumes up from downstairs. Now, being an experienced homicide detective and Detective Schultz came back and said that he recognized the odor of bodies decaying.
Bodies in the basement. It was an appalling idea that haunted detectives, some of whom had actually spent several hours inside Gacy's home in the rec room, just above the basement. Gacy himself had invited the detectives inside for drinks, perhaps out of arrogance, perhaps in an effort to taunt them. Based on these new clues, detectives pushed for a second search warrant. Then, late in the evening of December 20th, they followed Gacy to his attorney's office.
We were absolutely certain that at this point there was a confession because the attorneys were very, very, very nervous.
After spending the night on the couch at his attorney's office, Gacy was on the move. The exhausted detectives had followed him for 8 days. Christmas was just 4 days away. And finally, they believed Gacy was going to crack.
This was the beginning of the end for Gacy. He had apparently decided that he was going to commit suicide and was going to go around and say his last goodbyes.
One of Gacy's first stops was the Shell gas station, where he was a regular customer.
At that point, I go in the gas station. I recovered some drugs that Gacy had given to these people as he was saying his last goodbyes.
When I got that information, I told them to take him down, to arrest him. That was probably the closing of the news.
We rushed the car at a stoplight, pulled Gacy out of the car, threw him up against the trunk of the car, and told him that he was under arrest for a drug violation.
By December 21st, just 10 days after Rob Peace disappeared, John Wayne Gacy was headed for jail on a drug charge. He was connected to several missing boys, but not a single body had been found. As Gacy was led into the station, a second search of his house was just moments away. By the spring of 1992, the Menard State Penitentiary in downstate Illinois had been John Wayne Gacy's home for 13 years. And so, by the time he agreed to be interviewed, he had an answer for everything. Even when he was asked about the odor from the crawl space, Gacy had an explanation.
You know, I found it as odd when we bought the house that a house with a crawl space would need a sump pump. But then I learned the first time it rained that this ground gets wet under there, and then the crawl space actually floods up to a foot deep in water. And then as it recedes, it puts out a musty odor. There was always a musty odor in that house.
As for the day in December 1978, when a police detective thought he smelled decaying bodies, Gacy said it wasn't that at all.
We had come into the house, and my little Lhasa Apso was in the house. And, of course, he had been locked in the kitchen, you know, all day. Well, a little puppy, he piddles, see, and while he's piddling and while he is doing his business on the paper and that, you can imagine what it smells like if you go into a closed room and when the heat came on.
Still today, it seems inconceivable that Gacy would rely on such a defense. Because the truth about the crawl space became international news on the very day Gacy was arrested. On the night of December 21st, 1978, while John Gacy was held at the Des Plaines police station for possession of marijuana, the second search of his house began. While some officers looked for evidence upstairs, two went below into the crawl space. Moving on hands and knees, the evidence technicians surveyed the muddy ground. One officer took a shovel, dug down about 6 inches, and pulled up something hard. It was a human bone. While held at a local police station, Gacy complained of chest pains and was rushed to a nearby hospital. Detective David Hackmeister met him there.
I hadn't been there maybe 20 minutes or a half an hour when I got a phone call from my supervisor advising that they had found bones in the crawl space. At that time, Gacy was just being released from Holy Family Hospital, and I advised him at that point that he was under arrest for murder.
Defeated, Gacy looked straight at Hackmeister and said, "Dave, I'm ready to clear the air." He then confessed to the murder of more than 30 young men and boys.
He certainly held nothing back. He talked about the very first person that he killed, and that he had stabbed him to death, and that caused such a mess that he had to come up with another plan after that. Every person that he killed thereafter, he came up with a plan to strangle.
The specifics Gacy provided of torture in his house were staggering. He talked in detail about sexually abusing the boys and strangling them. As Gacy talked, the officers looked for some feeling in him, some emotion about what he had done. There was none.
In the confession room, I most clearly remember that there was no remorse. Very, very cold about it.
By the next day, word that bodies had been found at John Gacy's house had spread through the media. The Cook County medical examiner, Dr. Robert Stein, arrived and joined the crew to direct the exhuming of the bodies. First, they ripped out the floorboards of the house, exposing the crawl space completely. Some workers dug through the mud beneath the house. Others began to dismantle the garage. By midday, the first body bag emerged. The crew pressed on. A second body was carried out shortly after. On that first day, a ritual was established that would last as long as the digging continued. Each afternoon, Dr. Stein would report the discoveries of the day.
In the garage, there was just that one skeletalized remain, and in the house itself also a skeletalized remain.
No one knew how many bodies would eventually be found, but based on Gacy's confession, officials speculated that the number would be considerable.
When this whole thing is over, you might be witnessing one of the most horrible crimes, perhaps, in a century.
Early on, investigators brought in the one person who could provide the most help, John Gacy. He showed them one spot to check and then was quickly whisked away. Gacy's information about the graveyard beneath his house was remarkably precise. At one point, he even drew a sketch of the crawl space.
To this day, it's a bone-chilling little handwritten sketch because this guy knew where almost every body was. He didn't remember the names of them, or he wouldn't tell us the names, but he knew where they were in the basement.
All 6 bodies were essentially skeletalized.
For those working in the crawl space, the job was horrendous. Each time they dug a hole, it would immediately fill with water. They would sort through the mud by hand, picking up small bones. Whenever they found a skull, they placed a stake into the ground with an identifying number. Outside in the freezing cold, among the spectators was veteran crime reporter John Drummond.
It attracted the curious, despite the cold weather. People would come out there to see the scene because what had this scene ever happened before? No. The odor was terrible. All the investigators that we talked to afterwards admitted that the stench, despite the fact it was very cold weather, was overwhelming. It was terrible in there. The smell of death was everywhere as they went in there.
Some people came not just out of curiosity. They were relatives of young men who were missing.
I just have a grandson missing, and it's just a stab in the dark.
The number of bodies found today are 6.
Bringing the total to?
21.
In the final stages of the search, the Gacy house was completely dismantled. 29 bodies had been unearthed. But nowhere had they found Rob Peast, the young boy whose disappearance had initiated the investigation of John Wayne Gacy. The search for him would continue.
At this point in time, it would appear that we have removed those bodies from the crawl space.
As the search for bodies ended, there was one question the stunned public wanted answered. How had John Gacy gotten away with killing so many young men and boys for so many years? Behind the mask of the killer clown. In 1992, in his television interview from prison, John Gacy presented himself to the public as a man deeply concerned with the breakdown of family values.
Do you realize by 1993 that 50% of the American families will be single-parented? And that shows a breakdown in the church and not being able to hold families together. And for this reason, children run away from home and seek love in other places.
Twice divorced himself, he still claimed to live his own life according to very strict standards.
I've always looked after my children, even now. A lot of things that my dad did, I refuse to do because I don't believe in hitting children.
A good father, a concerned citizen. He said he was also a dedicated community servant.
I always felt that service community and community service to others, you know, in my religious background, I felt if you serve other people, it'll come back to serve you.
Ironically, for people who knew Gacy before his arrest, his statements were actually believable because the public life of John Gacy was that of a model citizen and loving father. As the bodies, one after another, were pulled from Gacy's house in December 1978, there was no group more stunned than the group of people who considered themselves Gacy's friends.
I still find it hard to believe him. I've known the man 4.5 years, and I thought the world of him.
To those who knew him, John Gacy was not only a successful businessman, he was also a good neighbor. Routinely, he opened his house for lavish holiday theme parties. But what many remembered about him most was that he often dressed up as a clown to entertain children.
At the top of it all, I mean, he used to do a lot of this charitable work. In other words, the guy was a clown, and he put on shows and all that, and the kids there, he treated the kids real good and all that.
But now, with the bodies being pulled from his basement, the world discovered another side to John Gacy. And suddenly, people wanted to know, who was this Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde? Attorney Greg Adamski, who later represented Gacy, discovered Gacy operated by his own rules.
Most of the things that all of us value, John had no value for at all. John didn't value other life. John didn't value other emotions. John didn't value any institutions. John didn't value the feelings of other people.
John Gacy grew up in Chicago. His father was reportedly abusive, and he had some health problems as a child. He was close to his mother and only sister. In his adolescent years, Gacy loved to dress up in uniforms. He scored 118 on an IQ test, which is in the bright normal range. He told doctors after his arrest that he committed his first murder when he was 15 years old and then couldn't stop. He made the statement in 1979 to the psychiatrist hired to help in his defense, Helen Morrison.
He started the pattern of what later is described as almost an addiction to homicide. And that's so similar to someone who's an addict that they'll be doing all right, and then there's a certain point where they almost have a craving. And it's not that they're after a human being, it's not that they've had a fight with anyone, it's not that they've remembered some traumatic episode from their childhood. It's just that simple and that terrifying.
Gacy was never charged with the murder he claimed to commit as a teen. And then in the 60s, he got married to a co-worker and went to work as a manager for a Kentucky Fried Chicken restaurant in Waterloo, Iowa. He became active in a local civic organization, the Jaycees, even named Man of the Year. Gacy had a young wife and children, but was developing a penchant for sex with young boys. In 1968, at age 26, he was convicted of sexually assaulting a teenage boy. He was sentenced to 10 years, but because he was such a model prisoner, he served only 18 months. Returning to Chicago, now divorced, he made a clean start, rejected his family, and became involved in Democratic Party politics, and was even photographed with then First Lady Rosalind Carter. He also married a childhood friend who had 2 young daughters of her own. In the early 70s, he began a small contracting business called PDM, painting, decorating, and maintenance. Outwardly, Gacy maintained a life that appeared meticulously in order. But unusual stories about him occasionally surfaced, like this one from a young man Gacy picked up for a night of cruising in March 1978.
I got in the car with him, and shortly after I got in the car with him, he placed a rag over my face, of which turned out to be chloroform, and proceeded to have a lengthy drive, and every time I would come to, the rag would go back over my face, and I remember him carrying me into his house, and then he put the rag over me, and that's the last thing I remembered until I found myself about 5:30 in the morning on the steps right by Lincoln Park, half dressed, my face completely burned.
Another young man described a night of torture to then State's Attorney Terry Sullivan.
He made him take his clothes off and tortured him with candles in one room, then filled the bathtub and would take him from the floor of the one room into the bathroom and shove his head underwater for excruciating long periods of time, to the point where this kid passed out a couple of times. It's amazing he didn't die at that particular time.
Neither story was believed, dismissed by police as lovers' quarrels. John Gacy's public persona never changed until the day the bodies were found, and Gacy's real story became a national news story, shocking even veteran crime reporters.
I could not understand how a man living in the city of Chicago, who was respected apparently by neighbors, active politically, could be responsible for doing something like this. To this day, it defies logic how he was able to kill 33 people and bury most of them on his property and get away with it for a number of years.
Later, it was learned that Gacy began burying the bodies under his house in 1972. By 1978, he believed the crawl space was full and found another way to dispose of his victims. After his arrest, he took police to a bridge over the Des Plaines River. Eventually, 4 more bodies were recovered. The last one, found in the spring, was Rob Peast, the boy whose disappearance had led police to Gacy. In April 1979, John Gacy was indicted for the murder of 33 young men and boys, the largest number of murders ever charged to one person in U.S. history.
In May 1978, he was back in the limelight, organizing the Polish Independence Day Parade in Chicago. The guest of honor was none other than First Lady Rosalind Carter. At a function that evening, the serial killer mingled just inches from the president's wife. By December, Gacy was committing a murder every 2 or 3 weeks. He showed no signs of stopping until an investigation into a missing youth would lead police to Gacy's front door. By 1978, 36-year-old John Wayne Gacy had sexually tortured and killed 32 young men. He had not only managed to cover up his crimes, but to keep up his status as a businessman and community leader in Chicago. On December 11th, Gacy met with a client of his contracting company at the Nissan Pharmacy in suburban Des Plaines. Gacy was bidding on a remodeling job. Around closing time, he abducted 15-year-old Rob Peast, who worked at the drugstore. Gacy had lured him into the car with the promise of a better-paying job with his company. The teenager was never seen alive again. He became Gacy's 33rd victim. The next day, after witnesses at the pharmacy said Peast was last seen with Gacy, police questioned him about the boy's disappearance.
He would say, I was in the drugstore, but I never saw him. You got the wrong guy. It was always, I'll cooperate. He had gotten away with so much before that he thought he was so smooth that he'd get away with this one just as easily.
This time, Gacy couldn't talk his way out of trouble. Police didn't buy his story and got a warrant to search his house. While they found nothing they could tie to Peast, they did discover numerous personal items belonging to other missing teenagers. Gacy was now a murder suspect, but without the bodies, little could be done. Gacy was placed under 24-hour surveillance. If he was nervous about the police presence, he was putting up a good front. The first night of the stakeout, Gacy picked up the officer's dinner tab.
My partner and I had to continuously remind each other that he's a suspect for murder. I mean, he was a very likable guy, and he never really intimidated you. He wasn't the kind of guy that you'd be afraid of, but he was a hustler.
Gacy even had the surveillance team over to his house for a fish dinner. When one of the officers smelled a foul odor coming from the air vents, investigators were all but convinced that the crawl space below had become Gacy's makeshift burial ground.
We weren't giving up, and he could not lose the evidence. He was sitting on the evidence. And he knew we were seeking a second search warrant. So John was cornered.
Gacy realized the truth about his serial killings would soon be exposed. Out of desperation, he met with his attorney for an all-night confession.
And then he looked at me and said, I've been the judge, jury, and executioner of many, many people. Now I want to be my own judge, jury, and executioner. I don't want you to interfere. I'm going to tell you everything from the beginning. I kept telling him it was unbelievable, and that's why he offered to show me the crawl space. He was going to prove to me that he committed the murders, and I don't want any part of that.
Amirati didn't need to see it, because within hours, investigators were on their way. They had their second search warrant. When they descended into the crawl space, it didn't take long for them to dig up a human bone. On December 21st, 1978, John Wayne Gacy was arrested for murder. At the police station, Gacy seemed to take the news well and even joked with police while they were booking him. When investigators asked where he was born, Gacy looked up and proclaimed that he was, quote, born in a state of confusion. The mugshot captured Gacy laughing at his own wit. Gacy also told police that he was not responsible for his brutal acts because he was suffering from a multiple personality disorder.
He knew we were going to get the rest of the bodies, and he knew we had human bones, and he knew we weren't going to stop. So now as he's backtailing, he's saying, all right, I'm nuts.
Gacy's home in suburban Chicago was besieged by a fleet of officers and evidence technicians. Captured on this rare police video, the excavation of the crawl space was carried out with the precision of an archaeological dig. Piece by piece, officers lifted the remains of Gacy's victims through the floorboards and carried them out the front door. It was then that John Wayne Gacy was introduced to the world as the worst serial killer in American history. Yet Gacy seemed more concerned with the police rummaging through his home than with his criminal notoriety.
He wanted to make sure his bar that had like 20-some cases of old Milwaukee sitting around it, that he made sure that nothing was done there and that we didn't dirty his floors.
Those who thought they knew him best, his own family, realized they had no idea who John Gacy was.
I went into first a denial stage, and then I went into anger. And I told him how much I just hated everything that he had brought upon us. And I saw in my mother, I saw something die in her. There was never that light again. There was never that twinkle in her eye from that day forth. It was like someone put the light out.
Of all the statements John Gacy made during his 1992 interview from prison, the most chilling were those he made about his victims and their families. His contempt for them was obvious.
That one mother that gets on television all the time who thinks I should be given 33 injections, I think she ought to take 33 Valiums and go lay down. She goes on Geraldo's show and all these other shows talking about, I think it's Maori, I think is the name. Her Marine son. Her Marine son, if her Marine son was so great, what the hell did he run away from home 12 times?
From the beginning, Gacy's victims were known as numbers that represented nothing more than the sequence in which they had been found. From the crawl space, they were taken to the county morgue, where the real work began, the job of identifying each body, changing the number to a name. The first body found turned out to be 17-year-old Johnny Butkovich, one of the boys who had worked for Gacy. The second was Greg Godzik, also an employee. As each name was announced, television crews raced to find the families.
He was a good boy. I'd spend anything to find him. I really would. And I think every mother would. It's just not me. I'm sorry for everybody else.
Darrell Sampson, John Zick, Randall Reffett. The faces filled the newspapers. Body number 13 was Johnny Maori, 19 years old, a former Marine. His mother, Dolores Nieder, last saw Johnny on September 15, 1977.
We would go out searching for him. We were playing detectives. We were searching for Johnny, looking for him. And already, Johnny was dead.
Dolores Nieder went to the police and reported her son missing. They were not helpful.
He said, no, he said, Johnny's a runaway. Oh, I was shocked when I heard that. I said, what has Johnny got to run away from?
It was the same with all the others. Not a single parent was believed. And for years, some police officers unwittingly played right into Gacy's hands.
And what he said to us, nothing wrong with Johnny. Johnny is not dead.
What made
He's
you...
missing. That's all what he say. He's run away. And I know right away it's not true. Because Johnny no got no reason to run away. If they listen to us, they save so many lives.
While the police claimed they were runaways, Gacy said they were all homosexual predators.
The biggest excuse that he came up with is that all of the victims made him do what he did. It was the victim's fault. If they hadn't pursued him, he wouldn't have had to do to them what he did.
But as investigators discovered the identities of the boys, it was clear that the majority were neither runaways nor male prostitutes.
Gacy had said they were gay. Johnny, I know, was not gay, but even if he was, no one has a right to take anyone's lives.
As more bodies were identified, the names kept coming. William Carroll, Robert Gilroy, Russell Nelson. They were all young, healthy, strong. How had Gacy managed to overpower the boys? The answer, Gacy was cunning, and he had a perfect ploy. In his black car, equipped with 2 spotlights, Gacy pretended to be a policeman. He would stop a boy walking down the street, flash a badge, and tell him to get in. Once inside the car, the boys were driven to Gacy's home. All he needed then was a good trick. He told officers how it worked with his last victim, Rob Peast.
He says, "No, it's a very simple trick." He says, "I'll show you how to do it. Put the handcuffs on." So he had Rob Peast actually put the handcuffs on himself and cuff himself behind his back. And Rob struggled with the handcuffs for several minutes and said, "Well, what's the trick here?" And John reached into his breast pocket and pulled out the key to the handcuffs and said, "The trick is you have to have the key."
With the boys restrained in the handcuffs, Gacy then moved on to his rope trick. Slipping a rope over the victim's neck and twisting a rod through it over and over until the young man collapsed.
Catch his sense of humor.
Shoelaces, huh? You're in trouble now. Aren't you afraid sitting that close to me? What the hell? Oh, this is too long. You don't need it this long. Okay. I had a rosary, which I carried in my pocket. I've always carried a rosary. It was my communion rosary. They said, well, what kind of a knot do you use? I said, what do you mean knot? When I tie things up? I says, depending on what I'm using it for, I said, the only thing I ever learned from Boy Scouts is a tourniquet knot. He said, well, show us what that is. So I took, at that time, and again, it's together, but in order to demonstrate it here, I took the rosary and I said, well, here, you put it around. This is hard trying to do this. Why don't you put your hand out? Okay, here. What I told him, I said, here, all you do is you wrap it around, you put one knot in it. And I said, then you put a second knot in it. Okay? Mm-hmm. I said, then you take a stick and stick it in here, and you just turn this. And I said, it causes a tourniquet. I said, that's the only knot I ever learned.
Precisely the kind of knot found on the ropes wrapped around the necks of the victims found under the house on Summerdale.
I'm getting better. Yeah, you learn fast, buddy. Later on, maybe I'll teach you something else. What's that? Oh, it's just a little trick, I know. Oh, here's a drink. Come on, drink it down. One hit, just like a man, huh? Ooh. Good boy. You liberal-minded about sex, Billy? Sorry? There's more than one way to get your rocks off. Got a girlfriend? I bet you've got a lot of them. Good-looking kid like you. Hmm? Thanks for the game. A good time? It's my pleasure. I gotta go. Sure. How about one for the road? I gotta get going. Wait a minute. What about that trick I was gonna show you? I don't know. I gotta get going. Hey, Billy. You worried about something? No, it's just late and I've gotta get going. It won't take a minute. I'll tell you what, I'll show you how you work it. You can play it on your girlfriend. How's that? Huh? I gotta put him on or something? No, you don't put him on. I put him on. What's that? Make sure they're locked now. There you go. Ooh, you got it locked real tight. I don't know if I could. Ow. Wow, that thing is really tight. Go ahead, hold this for a second. Some trick. Not bad, huh? How do you do it? There's a little lever right there. Just push that lever, they pop right on. You want to try it? Come on. Come on, give it a try. Not that way. Now you gotta have your hands in back of you. Huh? It's more impressive that way. People can't see what you're doing, right? Come on. That's a boy. That's one. That's two. Come on. Come on, try to get up. Can't do it. Hey, come on. Let me out. Please? Please. Please. You know what the real trick is? Here's the real trick. The real trick is having the key, you stupid bastard. Come on. Don't do this. Don't hurt me. Please don't hurt me. Please. Say please again. Please. Please. Please don't hurt me. Come on, pretty boy. Say please. Please. Please.
For the parents who heard the stories of their children's last moments, the image was horrifying.
I could never forgive Gacy for the rest of my life. How on earth can you forgive someone who takes a loving child from you and who does it in such, a tragic way?
Over a period of 6 years, John Gacy murdered at least 33 boys and was never discovered until finally the police listened to the parents of one child.
Believe me, if Rob Peast had been anyone but Rob Peast, if he had been a person that had run away on several occasions, we probably wouldn't have looked into it as closely as we had.
In the spring, 4 months after he disappeared, Rob Peast, the boy who stopped John Gacy, was buried. 9 other boys killed by Gacy were never identified and were buried in separate cemeteries around Chicago. And although the young victims have all now been properly laid to rest, the pain for the families is still very much alive.
Losing a child is just the hardest thing in life that you have to go through.
As John Gacy spoke from prison in 1992, he made it very clear that he was tired of being associated with other famous serial killers, especially the man who killed and then consumed his victims, Jeffrey Dahmer.
I'll tell you this, that's a good example as to why insanity doesn't belong in the courtroom. Because if Jeffrey Dahmer doesn't meet the requirements for insanity, then I'd hate like hell to run into the guy that does.
It is an ironic statement, coming from a man who 13 years before had pled not guilty to 33 murders, using the defense of insanity. On February 6, 1980, the first day of John Gacy's trial, people lined up at the criminal court building in Chicago, eager to get a glimpse of one of the most notorious serial killers of all time. Already, Gacy's story had received so much press coverage in Chicago that jurors had to be selected from Rockford, a city 50 miles north. The 16 men and women were bused to the courthouse and sequestered for the entire 6-week-long trial. Gacy was pleading not guilty by reason of insanity. And at first, it seemed the defense had an advantage. The judge was Louis Garippo.
If you really think about it, if the defense is insanity, and you have someone who's killed 33 people, everyone say, hey, there must be something wrong with that person. And I believe that in most, more than half of the jurors that were selected felt that there was something mentally wrong with John Gacy.
In their opening statements, attorneys for the prosecution argued that Gacy was evil. They displayed photographs of his victims on a board, nicknamed the Gallery of Grief. They promised to show that the murders of the young men were thoughtful, rational, and premeditated. The defense described Gacy as impulsive, deranged, a profoundly sick man who collected bodies like souvenirs. The question the jury had to decide, was Gacy crazy or evil? For the defense, a battery of experts testified that Gacy fit the standard of insanity. One was forensic psychiatrist Helen Morrison.
He could commit an act, but it didn't mean that he sat and planned the act. It was almost as if he were an automaton doing this behavior, and once the behavior was done, he was finished.
The psychiatric experts offered varying opinions of Gacy's mental illness: borderline personality, paranoid schizophrenia, amnesia. But the prosecution believed the facts of the case were more important than the psychiatric testimony. If the murders were not premeditated, they asked, why would Gacy have burial trenches dug in advance? Why did he keep handcuffs and a rope ready? If he didn't understand the criminality of his behavior, why would he deliberately choose victims who might not be missed? If he had amnesia, how could he draw a precise sketch locating each body? William Kunkel was the chief prosecutor.
Clearly, when you have this kind of intentional behavior, the pre-planning for all those things, the covering up, the post-planning, the post-conduct for all those things, and all this going on in the backdrop of what on the surface appears to be a perfectly normal existence, just doesn't fit.
As the jury heard the testimony and looked at Gacy, they saw a man at ease and very much in control of himself.
The theory or the thought or the fantasy about someone who's insane is that they're running down the street screaming, pulling their hair out without clothes on. And they could clearly see that he was not insane. I mean, he was sitting in the courtroom, he was participating, smiling, being considerate of where people were sitting.
The jury also learned that Gacy ran a successful business, was involved in politics, and was active in his community. All rare accomplishments for someone truly mentally ill.
A real medical model psychiatrist that really treats patients and understands mental illness will never believe that you can turn this kind of serious mental illness off like a faucet. Did he have personality disorders? Absolutely. Was he a sexual deviant? Of course, but psychotic, not even close.
Throughout the trial, Gacy remained confident, certain that he would win the case.
He had been in the back and he was reading the Chicago Sun-Times and some of the ads in there. And he had torn out a page and he had circled a party, a St. Patrick's Day party, that was to be coming up. And he had the bailiff give it to me on the table and he said, I'll see you there.
But then, toward the end of the trial, there was testimony that the defense believed was a final blow against Gacy.
At that time, there was a psychiatrist who testified that if he was found insane, he would be put out on the street because he could not be hospitalized against his will. That, obviously, no one in their right mind believed that this man was sane, but no one was willing to take the chance that he would be out on the street.
The last dramatic argument came from William Kunkel.
I said to the jury, I said, well, if you want to show mercy, and then I just stopped in mid-sentence. I turned around and I walked over to the victim board, and real slow, I ripped each photo off the board with a loud snap. take my time, about 2 minutes, to get all 22 off in my hand, and I walked back in front of the jury box right in their faces, and I said, look, if you want to show this man mercy, you show him the same mercy he showed when he took these 22 lives off the face of the earth and put them here. And I just threw them in the crawl space opening, walked away. I left a couple of minutes of pin drop silence in the courtroom, and that was a good point.
The jury took only one vote and unanimously agreed to find John Gacy guilty of 33 counts of murder. The next day, they sentenced him to death. Throughout the many years he spent in prison, convicted serial killer John Gacy had little trouble keeping busy. He spent much of his time painting.
This is Christ as I see him in my cell. And it's monolithic because Christ, to me, is monolithic. He's all things to all people. This here is the Hi-Ho series. This is called Hi-Ho Around the Campfire.
Many who knew him there said Gacy actually enjoyed prison. He thrived on the regularity of life in an institution. Karen Conti was one of his appellate attorneys.
His life outside of prison was just completely filled with anxiety for him. He had options. He could kill, he could not kill. There was this good and bad that was a constant dilemma in his life. When he was in prison, all of that was removed. He had his life set up in a very orderly fashion.
If you want to know what my life is like, I log it every day. For the last 12 years, all you got to do is ask. I can tell you everything. I can tell you the first meal they served me here because I do it daily.
What do you do all day?
Every phone call, everything that I do, every time an officer's around me is logged. Every movement that I make is in the book here.
Filling the pages of Gacy's log were hundreds of hours spent with attorneys who were representing him in the appellate courts. As ardent opponents of the death penalty, working together, they had taken on one of the most unpopular cases in the country.
First of all, we got death threats. We had clients who quit us. We carried a baseball bat from the garage to the house after a while. We had bomb threats.
Dozens of legal issues were raised on behalf of Gacy, while he maintained that he was not the one who killed the boys in his basement.
At the time of my arrest, there was 4 other suspects, all employees of PDM contractors, all with keys to the house.
To the end, Gacy denied his guilt.
After 14 years on death row in an Illinois prison, fighting to overturn his sentence, Gacy's time is running out. His lawyers are scrambling to block Tuesday's scheduled execution.
Mr. Gacy is, unfortunately, the person that everybody holds up to support the idea that capital punishment is right and that it works and that it's just.
But prosecutors say he's exhausted his options.
I don't want to see any last-minute delays. The case has been pending for 14 years. His lawyers had an obligation sometime in the last 14 years to bring up whatever they're trying to bring up today.
Most Chicagoans agree and are fed up with paying millions of tax dollars to keep a confessed serial killer alive.
We've wasted enough money on him already.
He just doesn't have a purpose on this planet.
Not surprisingly, even activists admit that Gacy may be the perfect argument for capital punishment, but they want to keep him alive, saying that any execution sends out the wrong message.
The unavoidable truth is that the death penalty makes premeditated killers of us all. We become the very thing that we condemn.
Still, for the victims' families, it'll be justice served when, barring any last-minute reprieve, Gacy dies by lethal injection in a small execution chamber at Stateville Penitentiary. Frank Courier, CBS News, Joliet, Illinois.
33 bodies were found in all. Now, John Gacy's fate for committing these hideous crimes would be determined in a Chicago courtroom. In February 1980, 37-year-old John Wayne Gacy went on trial in Chicago for the murders of 33 young men and boys. His case attracted widespread attention as people struggled to understand how anyone could be responsible for so many appalling crimes. Hoping to save Gacy's life, his attorneys entered a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. John did not appear worried about being considered a crazed serial killer. Instead, he was afraid the public might think he was homosexual, a charge he denied.
I would definitely not be homosexual. I have nothing against what they do, and I don't deny that I've engaged in sex with males, but that I'm bisexual.
Gacy was no textbook criminal. Even the psychiatric experts who testified at his trial were baffled by his complex personality.
He fit absolutely nowhere. No known diagnostic categories. Part of it is because we don't know what these serial murderers are. We know what they do, but we don't know what they are.
The jury was not interested in figuring out who John Gacy was. On March 13, 1980, Gacy was found guilty and sentenced to death. Afterwards, he consoled his defense team and then asked to speak with his prosecutors.
He congratulated them for doing a great job. He said they did what they had to do, and he respected what they did, and they did a great job, and he actually congratulated them on getting the death penalty.
The serial killer was sent to death row at the Menard Correctional Center in southern Illinois. He quickly cashed in on his criminal celebrity by becoming an artist. Gacy's artwork won praise from those who appreciated the macabre image of a killer clown. In 1988, John exploited his notoriety by proclaiming his innocence. He wrote and published a book he titled A Question of Doubt. In it, he passed himself off as the 34th victim and claimed that all the bodies discovered beneath his home were planted there by his employees.
The idea that I'm a homosexual thrill killer, that I strolled down the streets and stalked young boys and slaughtered them. Hell, if you could see my schedule, my work schedule, you know damn well that I was never out there.
One person who kept on believing Gacy was his mother, Marion. Then after a series of strokes, she lost all memory of her son and his crimes. She died in 1989.
I wanted him to have this breakthrough. I wanted him to have this all of a sudden, all right, there's no more pretense, there are no more appeals. Now I can tell you I did it and this is why I did it. I was waiting for it, but it just never came. It was like a book with no ending.
As the years went by, each and every appeal was denied. At last, a final execution date was set. May 10th, 1994, 14 years after his conviction.
There was nothing was going to delay the killing of John Gacy, because the people were bound and determined that John Gacy was going to be killed.
Throughout the years on death row, Gacy claimed that he was not worried. He had no reason to fear the day he would die.
If you believe you've lived your life the right way, then you do not have nothing to fear, in my case.
You're not worried about facing God?
No. I'm fairly comfortable with him. I've been at the Catholic services, I'm the server for the priest for the last 10 years. I have no qualms about doing that. I've had confession, I have communion, and I am at peace with myself.
On the morning of his execution, Gacy was flown from his downstate prison to the death chamber at Stateville Correctional Center.
We have attorneys on standby that will be available to the very end to fight any attempts to stay this execution.
By 7 that evening, the U.S. Supreme Court denied a last request for a stay of execution.
At the end, Gacy wanted to speak with each of the lawyers separately. He took me aside and he wanted to thank me for trying as hard as I could and for keeping him occupied with jokes and for being kind to him and calling him and keeping him informed.
Even while the crowds cheered outside his cell, Gacy did not believe he was going to die.
At about 11:15 on the night that Gacy was killed, one of us called up Gacy and said, "How are you doing?" And Gacy said, "You know what? Can this wait? Can I talk to you in a while?" We said, "No, John, I can't wait. I mean, what do you mean a while?" He said, "Call back in an hour or two." I said, "John, you're going to be dead in an hour or two. What are you thinking about?"
There was a candlelight vigil by opponents of the death penalty, but far more people clearly were in favor of his execution. Just after midnight, with relatives of his victims watching on a television in the prison basement, Gacy was strapped to a gurney in the execution room. He was given 3 lethal injections.
John Wayne Gacy was pronounced dead at 12:58 a.m.
He got a much easier death than any of his victims. In my opinion, he got an easier death than he deserved. But the important thing is that he paid for his crimes with his life.
A few months after Gacy's execution, a ceremony was organized. Relatives of the boys who were killed were invited to take a painting by Gacy and burn it. It was nothing more than a symbolic gesture, but for many, it seemed to fulfill a goal: to rid the world once and for all of the grisly horror that John Wayne Gacy had created. John Wayne Gacy, a prominent Chicago area businessman. Well-liked and respected, Gacy camouflaged a terrible secret. In 1978, in Des Plaines, Illinois, 15-year-old Robert Piest was reported missing. Having learned that Gacy was preparing a remodeling bid for a drugstore where Piest worked, Chief Detective Joseph Kozenzak of the Des Plaines Police Department goes to Gacy's home. Gacy denies knowing Piest. But investigators are suspicious. A background check reveals Gacy was once convicted of the sexual abuse of a teenage boy. Kozenzak places Gacy under surveillance. Initially cooperative with the police, Gacy becomes increasingly surly as Kozenzak's investigation continues.
You could feel that there was hatred there, and that he really didn't care what we were investigating and was more concerned about trying to stay out of the way.
Gacy threatens a lawsuit if police continue their surveillance. Officers persist, suspecting that Gacy has much to hide. But even they are not prepared for what they'll find. The goal of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit is to map the mind of the serial killer.
So many people believe that it's the sexual act itself that he's performing with the victim that is of primary importance to him. In reality, it's the entire game that's important to them. The selection process, the surveillance, knowing that I have selected you to become my victim and you don't know it. And then all of the planning that goes into the stages of actually conducting the abduction. And so they are rehearsing this and living this maybe for weeks or months before the actual abduction occurs. And to a certain extent, the sexual activity afterwards may almost be an aftermath.
With each killing, Gacy refined his methods, learned from his mistakes, and improved on his successes. He eventually grew so confident that he brazenly targeted a boy from his own neighborhood. Many victims came to Gacy's home hoping to get a job with his contracting firm. He'd meet with them in his garage. The soundproof garage was designed by Gacy and constructed by his company. A motorized door was the only way in or out. If his victim didn't object, Gacy would demonstrate a magic trick using trick handcuffs.
Like this, real good, right? Okay, ready?
After showing how the handcuffs work, Gacy would persuade his victim to try them. Then he would challenge him to attempt the trick behind his back. If the victim agreed, the trap was sprung. Gacy would switch the trick handcuffs for real ones. Gacy would switch the trick handcuffs for real ones. Once immobilized, the victim was at Gacy's mercy.
Now just relax.
I can't get him off.
You're not relaxing enough. The problem is, it's like Houdini. He always relaxed his muscles when he was doing a trick like that.
Look, man, you freak.
No, relax.
Get off of me!
Relax.
Get off of me! No! Get off!
Another body being brought out to be taken away. Total count now 27 bodies at the home of John Wayne Gacy.
John Gacy, a man who liked to put on a clown suit and entertain children. Now he is charged with one murder, and the police have found, at last count, 27 bodies buried under his house and garage, and 2 more in a nearby river, while Gacy is in a hospital bed, tied down. Here's Jim Cummins.
John Wayne Gacy was also Pogo the Clown, who loved to make kids laugh. He was married twice, divorced twice, and had 2 children. A Democratic Party precinct worker with political connections. A modestly successful building contractor. His neighbors knew him as Johnny, the life of the party.
He was a very good neighbor, and we socialized with him.
Carol Samankowitz was once Gacy's housekeeper and had a couple of dates with him.
You didn't expect it from him. He was a nice guy.
This is the other John Gacy, in leather restraints at a jail hospital, charged with 1 murder, the suspect in at least 28 others.
One of John Gacy's neighbors said all of this is like a nightmare, and it will be several years before this neighborhood recovers from that nightmare.
Gacy's home has become a tourist attraction. Every day for a week, outsiders came here to see bodies brought out of Gacy's house. His neighbors will never forget that.
You see bodies in your sleep, you see him in your sleep. It's just too much.
Today, a young man named Jeff Rignall filed a criminal complaint alleging Gacy raped him. And Rignall suggested Gacy may have had an accomplice. The crowds stayed away from Gacy's house today because police said they think they found all the bodies in the house. They plan to search the yard when the sub-zero weather breaks. That's when they also plan to resume dragging this river, where they found 2 bodies so far and expect to find 3 more.
Okay, we'll try. What kind of man was Mr. Gacy? What kind of a man? How would you characterize him?
Oh, I don't know. I characterize him. I thought he was a pretty fine person. Very good. Very. Very amiable. I liked him. Even now, I like him. I feel sorry for him that this has happened, but he's been a wonderful person, a very generous person to us.
Now, what kind of a neighbor was he?
Very good neighbor. If there was a case that I needed to borrow a tool from the man because he had many good tools, he was more than willing to let me have anything I wanted, anything.
Now, of course, we know that the problem here is the story of these bizarre occurrences, murders right next door to your home. Did you ever hear anything that would indicate to you that there was foul play going on over there?
Never a sound, not a sound, never. Not even, you know, like they've asked about screaming or anything, never a sound out of that house. I suppose we should have cleared the clothes out, but my son says he's left out there most of his things in here. And here comes the spade. I don't know if you want him in there. That's Peanut. And go, Ed. Pardon? Open the door. Okay. The depth to the bottom or the floor height? Which would you prefer?
The bottom of it, I guess.
The bottom of it is 39 inches. That's the depth for the crawl space.
Put it in dead center.
This will show it deeper, of course. Because the floor height, I think, is about 52 inches.
Okay.
So, you know, I contend that he must have been busy filling it with something. Because there is awful lot of room.
It would have been about 30 inches till you'd hit the...
40 inches.
40 inches.
40 inches to the bottom of the rafter. These are 2x10 rafters.
Yeah.
This is the lowest point, is that steel beam which supports the entire length of the house. The rafters are all... You're running. The insurance company had it cost $14,000. The building cost $30,000. We built it for $28,000. All the furniture upstairs here. They burned these walls down. All this area to half in the kitchen is burned out.
You're an automatic, John, so you got light powers.
And one day, all I did was flip the toggle switch on the furnace, went to storm, come back down the street. They set the rafters on fire and burned the walls of the bathroom. Oh, no. Half an hour. When I ran back in the house to cut the power, the firemen were right behind me.
The search for victims of John Wayne Gacy may be shifted to the basement of this building on Chicago's near north side. A carpenter has told authorities that when Gacy's contracting company remodeled the basement in 1976, it had a bad smell, which Gacy blamed on dead rats. The subcontractor also claimed that Gacy worked at night in the basement, pouring concrete. So far, the 28 bodies attributed to Gacy were found exactly where Gacy told authorities to look, in the crawl space of his suburban home or in a nearby river. There has been no mention till now of any other location. In court on Tuesday, a Gacy victim who lived. Jeff Rignell claims to have been chloroformed and raped by Gacy. Rignell wants the charges against Gacy changed from misdemeanor to felony. Rignell claims that when he first complained of Gacy's sexual attack on him, police treated it as a joke. Rignell's complaint was last May. Since then, at least one more youth, Robert Piest, has disappeared. And though Robert Piest's body has not been identified among the 28 Gacy victims in the Cook County morgue, it is the Piest murder with which Gacy is charged. Matt Quinn, ABC News, Chicago.
John Wayne Gacy, accused of killing 33 young men. Prosecutor Terry Sullivan called Gacy's insanity defense hogwash. In his confession, Gacy admitted killing the young men after having sex with them, then burying most of the bodies under his house. The prosecutor called Gacy a vile, evil, diabolical murderer who must be held responsible for his acts. Gacy chuckled. The photos of the 22 identified victims were displayed. Murder, Sullivan said as he pointed to each one. Murder. John Wayne Gacy, guilty of murdering 33 young men. Gacy was convicted of murdering more people than anyone else in U.S. history. He showed no emotion as the verdict was read. Gacy, a building contractor, was arrested in December 1978 in connection with the disappearance of a 15-year-old boy. Later that month, police began uncovering bodies from a crawl space under Gacy's suburban Chicago home. 29 bodies were eventually found on Gacy's property, 4 others found in a nearby river. Gacy had confessed to the killings, but his lawyers claimed he was insane.
5 years later, on May 10th, 1994, Gacy's execution date arrived. He was to die by lethal injection at the Stateville prison in Joliet, just south of Chicago. His sister Karen was there for the final hours.
I was losing a brother. I was losing someone that I loved. Of course, there was great sadness to have to part and say a final goodbye, to know that this person's not dying because they're sick. They're dying because someone's going to murder them.
Hundreds gathered outside the prison walls to celebrate Gacy's execution. Supporters of the death penalty believed that if anyone should be executed, it was John Gacy. The revelers waited for the countdown.
We had all leaned over, and I said, "John, have you made your peace with God?" And he said, "I have." And he said, "I love you." That was the very last thing he said, "I love you." And I told him the same thing, that I loved him. And I guess that's when it all came to a head, that this was it.
While he was still alive, they were celebrating his death. Hundreds of demonstrators eager to see John Wayne Gacy executed. Outside the prison, as the midnight deadline approached, their numbers grew. "Kill the clown," they chanted. Many had come dressed for the occasion. John Gacy once worked as Pogo the Clown, the children's entertainer. He was the successful businessman who'd met the wife of President Carter. And he was the killer who lured 33 young men and boys to his home, where he strangled them and buried them beneath the floorboards. He was killed when chemicals were injected into his body, dying after just under 20 minutes, even though one of the poisons failed to work properly.
His last words were, in essence, that taking his life would not compensate for the loss of the others, and he basically said that he saw this as the state murdering him, and he didn't think that would serve justice.
The celebrations reached their climax. There, too, more than 20 relatives of Gacy's victims.
I'd like to see death row cleaned out. I'd be glad to see one of them on a day executed, or have a mass execution would be quite satisfactory with me.
Gacy had painted on death row and raised thousands of pounds for his family. As he was strapped down and executed, an art gallery held an auction of his works, one of which was priced at £35,000. Bill Neely, ITN, Washington.
At 12:40 a.m., John closed his eyes and took a deep breath before the doctor injected the needle. 18 minutes later, 52-year-old John Wayne Gacy was dead. At 3 a.m., his body was secretly transported to a nearby hospital where Dr. Helen Morrison, a forensic psychiatrist, waited to extract Gacy's brain.
There are so many questions, basically, that come up. What happened prenatally? What happened in the development? What happened to the brain? Can we start doing some human experimentation?
Dr. Morrison thought Gacy's brain might show signs of abnormality that could possibly explain his actions. Yet, after examining it, she found nothing. No biological evidence that shed light on Gacy's severe psychological problem, leaving the world with an enduring mystery.
I believe, and continue to believe, that what we don't know about John Gacy is more vast than we will ever imagine in my lifetime or in yours.
When he was good, John, he was the best of good, and he had a high drive for success. But when he was bad, he was the worst of evil, and he had a high drive for destruction.
Johnny didn't even know who Johnny was. Johnny was playing a role, like on a stage. Various parts. Maybe he would have been what he wanted to be. That governor, that politician, that senator. You know, we talk here of all these things. He had the capability.
None of it makes sense. For his character, for everything we knew about him, I just can't picture that his sexual appetite got so much out of control. I don't think we ever know the person. I really don't. I don't think there's any way you can ever know what's going on through another person. And it's kind of scary to think that we don't know. I mean, we just really don't know.
It needs more of a hand, I will. Want me to rinse it off? Just so that you're handling it, Al, or do you want some
Nothing?
milk?
No, just a minute. All right.